Just a few days ago, Canon announced the release of the Canon R6 Mark II. I watched about every YouTube video and every article I could find from the folks that Canon let review this pre-production camera, and I soaked up all the specs and how the camera is performing for its reviewers. But what I lacked in my research was any wildlife photographers, anything about wildlife photography for this camera. So with all this info, do I think it would be a good bird and wildlife camera? Well, let's talk about it. This camera refresh was a little bit out of the blue for us. Normally a camera cycles about 3 to 5 years from the last model to the new model. But with the addition of mirrorless cameras in this space, that's kind of gone out the window. So the refresh rates on these cameras are a little bit odd. But I think I know why this camera was released at the time it was, about a year earlier than normal. And I'll get into that later after we go through the pros and cons of this camera for bird and wildlife photography. So real quick about new cameras, I usually don't get into, I probably won't do any reviews talking about or things talking about speculation on cameras that haven't been released, or Canon or Nikon or Sony hadn't come out and said, hey, here is the specs and this camera's coming out on this date. Because a lot of times we get things wrong, and you know, I take it with a grain of salt what I see at the rumor sites, just like this camera is a prime example. All the rumors were talking about it was going to be the 24 megapixels, which they got right. It was going to have 30 frames per second, which was a little off. And it would have a backside stack sensor and all these things. And I knew at that time there's no way this thing was probably going to have a stack sensor or all these features, because if they did, that'd basically be an R3 camera in an R6 body. And there's no way Canon's going to have a $25 camera be a direct compete to their $65 camera. Plus that would make all the R3 owners really mad. So where I figured they'd pull it back would probably be in the sensor, because they could probably make a little better sensor but not be a stacked or backside illuminated, and sure enough that's where they pulled this camera back to put it in line where it needs to be. But let's get into the pros and cons of this camera for what I can gather, and we'll talk about it in the instance of wildlife photography. So that's what we're going to talk about, the pros of wildlife photography and the cons of wildlife photography for this camera. So the first thing in the pros, and I had to write all this stuff down because I don't want to get lost here and ramble too much, because you know I can do that quite well. The first thing is the upgrade of the autofocus. And this looks like to be the R7 autofocus, which was a trickle down from the R3, which is excellent. So it really does well there. So everything I could see on the autofocus looked just like the R7, maybe a little bit better tweak. Has the same Digix processor. Now maybe they added a little faster cycle, because you got to remember processors kind of like your computer chip in your camera, or in your computer, excuse me. So it could have a little better clock speed, but it looks to be the same processor. It has the same 12 frames per second and mechanical shutter as the same as the R6 did. But what they did do, which surprised me even, was they went to 40 frames per second in electronic. That's double what it had before, because it had 20 before. And uncompressed RAW also. And it's the same 12-bit rate, 12-bit image, excuse me, as the R5, R6, and R7 have when it's an electronic shutter, those faster ones. When it's a mechanical, you're at 14-bit on the image, which is pretty good. But 12-bit is still really good. This next part took me a bit to find, and I could only find it in one video where it's about the sound in electronic shutter. So you know in the R5 and R6 you have no sound when you get into that 20 frames a second, and that's why with my R5 I don't shoot electronic, because I don't have any tactile sensation of the frames going on. But in one video they talked about, oh, you can shoot in 40 frames per second, and they hit that shutter and you could hear that R7 shutter sound. So, but nobody showed in the menu where you could adjust the sound, and because those guys only had like a couple hours probably to use that camera part of the day, they didn't have time to go to every setting. But it looks like we're going to have the sound and electronic shutter on that camera, which is really good, and that'll make it really nice, because that's the one thing I like about the R7 over the R5 is when I'm shooting faster I can hear that shutter sound. So the R6 has an upgraded sensor, has a faster readout speed, it looks like. The R6 had rolling shutter issues at higher shutter speeds, not as bad as the R7 with that rolling shutter. And to my surprise, and to the reviewer's surprise, when they were showing the image they were taking during a tennis match in these review videos, You could still see some bows in the racket and some warp in the ball when it was changing direction real fast, but it was pretty negligible in the amount of rolling shutter. Now, we'll have to test this when we get a production version of this camera to see if we have the things like with the bird's landing or something's high and low in the frame. Is it still fast enough to keep the wing positions in the same space? Or is it just really negligible where it's really, you have to look at it to tell if there's wing position changes? We'll just have to see. Other things they added into this camera was raw burst mode, and that's the same as the R7. Remember, the R3 does not have raw burst mode, but they probably could do that during with software. But the pano mode from the R7, a lot of people don't know about the pano mode in the R7 and the R10. It's basically the same as you have your cell phone where you put it in pano mode, click it, and run the camera across, and it captures everything. You don't have to click, 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 and stitch it in post. But the R7 has that, and now this R6 Mark II has it. The autofocus I said a minute ago was upgraded. It's probably the same or a little bit better than the R7, probably because the sensor's better. A better sensor makes better autofocus because it's got things to look at. I think you're starting to see a trend here, the R7 stuff in this camera. It has a new deep learning, machine learning that they've loaded to this thing for the autofocus. Horses and trains were added to that, which is really nice, I think, because of horses. That means my problem with the mooses may go away. Or even elk, if you shoot elk, those type things, it doesn't find the eye as easily unless it's real prominent on the animal. Another cool thing about autofocus, it gives you the ability to choose which eye you're looking at. Right now, basically you'll get a box with two arrows on the outside of it, and I'm seeing my monitors, I'm recording it, it's on my eye, and I see the little arrows going. If you click those arrows, it can jump from one eye to the other eye because it sees both eyes, and it gives you a box on the eye you're on, and it tells you if you click it, it'll jump to the other eye. Why that's really cool is you want to have the eye that's closest to you. So let's say I'm looking this way to the right. You don't want to focus on this right eye, you want to focus on the left eye because the left eye is closer to the camera, and vice versa. If I'm this way, you want the right eye, not the left eye. Especially on your animals the same way. If the animal's head's a little bit and you're really at a narrow, tight field of plane, you're getting one eye in focus and the other eye not in focus, that's really good to be able to switch that eye focus. It's pretty cool. 8 stops of IBIS now. The EVF I think is the same, but they added OVF, same as the R7 has on it, and the R3. The OVF is optical viewfinder. And what that means, it just looks like your DSLR. What you see in your field of view is going to look the same through the viewfinder. I'm not real keen on that. I prefer to use the EVF because the whole point to me of that mirrorless makes it better for my photography is the EVF shows you exposure simulation. So as you're running your ISO, your shutter, your aperture, you can see the light changing and how it affects the bokeh and the subject and the light around the subject. So having an OVF, I don't see that. It's just like using DSLR. It's almost feels like a step backwards. With EVF, I can see what I'm going to get in the frame, which is really nice. The layout and ergonomics is about the same for the Mark I version of the R6, except for a couple of exceptions. They moved the on-off and lock to a switch right behind the top dial in the back. I like this because now you have to make a concerted effort to move the on-off. You're not accidentally turning your camera off. They did move another thing they did, they put stills and video selector on the left side. Now that is kind of a problem for people that are used to turn their camera on and off on the left side like the R6 and the R5, but that's where your stills to video is. Now, if you remember me talking about the R7, one of the things I loved the most about the R7 was to be able to go to power off or off power and then right to video. So I can switch from stills to video with just a flip of a switch, not have to change the dial like the R6 Mark I had or the R10 had. So I really like the way they've got that set over there. So I think it'd be real easy to jump from stills to video if you're doing both, especially like I do. So there's no time limit on the recording on this camera, which is nice in video, especially for me when I'm in the studio. I sometimes go over 30 minutes and I have to get up with the R5 and have to go restart it. So the R6 Mark II, no time limit recording, which is really nice. Its max recording is 6K oversampled, uncropped at 4K at 60 frames a second, which is really good. It also has 1080p up to 180 frames per second. That's up from 120 to 180. What does that mean for us in wildlife? Well, 120 is where you do your slow motion. You get those buttery slow movements and the birds, you know, flapping. But 180 frames a second, you can slow that down even more. So if you got something like a hummingbird or something like that, you can actually see a little more of the wing motion than you could before. And it has the same variable angle LCD, so when you're getting the low shots or side shots, things like that, it's still cool. I think that's pretty much it for me for wildlife photography for the pros. There may be some more. If you guys think of some or know of some, leave them down in the comments for me. All right, let's talk about the cons that I see in this camera for wildlife photography. And there's only a couple of cons in this camera. It looks like it'd be a really good camera, but one of these cons to me is a big doozy for how I shoot and what I need in my shooting modes and methods. The first thing we'll talk about is the dual card slot. It's an SD2 card slot, same as the R7. The buffer's a touch better on the R6 Mark II versus R7, but from all the reviewers, they said you got about 2 seconds to about 75 frames, which is pretty close to what the R7 gets in its 30 frames per second. What I found interesting was no reviewer bagged this camera about its buffer when it comes to shooting high speed. When you remember all the R7 videos, everybody dogged that camera, the R7, because it had a bad buffer, they said, because you only got that, you know, second and a half or whatever, and 60 or 70 frames a second, or 60 frames in one burst. So it looks like you're getting 5 to 8 more frames in that burst is all you're getting out of this camera, so it's pretty interesting. So that's one thing. The next part is the rolling shutter. Yes, rolling shutter still exists. It's going to exist on any camera that doesn't have a fast enough sensor speed, readout speed that is. And the only ones that are having a fast enough readout speed where you're almost seeing no rolling shutter or weird wing movements, thing like that in a bird. And that's with the stacked sensor cameras. But this one is pretty good. So this is really a negative, but not a negative. It's much better rolling shutter than the R7 and the R6 Mark I. Do we know if it's better than the R5? Well, we won't know until we can get hold of a production model of this camera to test it and A/B it to the R6 Mark II versus the R5 and see if the readout speeds and the rolling shutter are better. But it does exist, but I don't think it's that big a deal. Rolling shutter hadn't been a big problem even for me with R7. I do lose some shots, but I still have enough of the other shots where I'm good for the day. The last thing about this on the cons is the big one for me, and that is the megapixels in this camera. It's 24.2 megapixels, which is pretty much the same as the R3. And for me, that's a little too tight on megapixels. I think really the sweet spot's about 32, 35 and higher for cropping in, because we've just all gotten pretty used to that level of megapixels to crop in. So if you need to crop or recomposition your picture, you're going to be limited on how far you can go to crop or recomposition on these big cameras. I don't own the R3, and the only reason I don't own the R3 is because the megapixels of that camera. When I rented it and took it out for a week or so to test it out, I love that camera. I love the autofocus. I love the ergonomics. I love the speed of it. Everything about it. I like how it spun the motors on the big cameras. But I didn't pick it up because of the megapixels. When I had small birds or I had anything small in the frame, and if I had to crop any about 80, 70%, I just didn't have any detail in there. I was losing detail because it's just not enough megapixels. Even when you're using the R5 and you're shooting in crop mode, you're at 17. I don't crop at all in that. None whatsoever. I just feel like it's not enough megapixels for me to, you know, to shoot for wildlife. Now, if you're shooting bigs, it's a different matter. So really, I think those are my main cons of this camera in what I've seen so far. Now, when we get hold of a camera in our hands, we'll see. So what are my final thoughts and my recommendations on this camera for wildlife photography, at least how I see it? I said in my R7 video, I really felt like the R7 was an experimental camera in that crop body sensor and a lot of new features and they moved a lot of buttons around. There's a lot of different stuff in that camera. And as you see in this R6, I believe that was what it was. They put that out there, saw what people like, what they didn't like, and they pretty much stuffed all that R7 technology, those trickled down from the R3, into the R6 and probably improved them a little bit. So all that, the pano, the burst, the autofocus, all those things made it into this camera, and even added, you know, I thought it was going to be 30 frames per second, even added 40 frames per second there, so it stuffed all that in there. I also said earlier in this video, I really thought I knew why this camera came early in 2 years on the refresh, and I think it's really about camera market share. I think it's really out there to compete with the Sony a7 IV. It has a lot of upgrades in the video past what the A7 IV had. It basically one up the A7 IV, and I also think it's probably guessing what the Nikon Z8 is going to come out with this video capabilities. I really think that's what Canon's doing on this, because it's trying to pull some of that market share away from Sony back to Canon. And with the possible R100 coming out, I think that's going to compete with the Sony's vlogging camera. So you got to know that most of the influencers or content creators out there in the world, they're really running A7 IVs. That's their favorite hybrid camera. It shoots pretty good stills and really good video. But now with this R6 Mark II, it has much better video than the A7 IV. It has tremendously better autofocus and stills capability. So it's a much better hybrid camera. So I think they're really going after that market. It's really about market share. So the final part of recommendation. Is this good for wildlife and birds? And my answer to that is yes and no. I know that's not really the greatest answer you want to give. It's like a cop-out answer, but stay with me here a second. Let me say why. If you're shooting bigs, bears, elk, things like that a lot, or you're able to get your subjects 2/3 or bigger in the frame of what you're shooting, I think this is a great camera. Going to be phenomenal for you. If you're a hybrid shooter, you shoot a lot of stills and a lot of video, this camera's a no-brainer. It's going to be great. Where do I say it's not good? If you're a shooter like me, where I'm shooting some smalls, I'm shooting things that are sometimes farther away in the frame, like pikas, Tweety birds, things like that, and they're only about a quarter or less in the frame, you just don't have enough room to crop. And that's, like I said before, that's where the R3 fell apart for me. I really think the R3 is really made for weddings and for cars and things like that. I think that's really what that camera was, and for some general sportings for reporters, things like that. So I think in that case, it's not it's going to be as good. That's the no part. So it's a little of both. I think a lot of people do use the R6 for wildlife, but I think they're finding the same things I've seen, where it's just hard to crop in your image. Well, that's my thoughts on the Canon R6 Mark II for birds and wildlife photography. I personally won't be picking this camera up. It's not because I think it's a bad camera. I've just got a couple other gear acquisitions and things I'm doing in that space right now, so I really don't have the freedom to free up for that camera. Now, once it does come out, I will rent a copy of it from Stewart's or something, or find somebody that picked the camera up and see if they'll let me borrow it for a couple days to do a fairly thorough review of that camera, because I'm really curious as where Canon's going, how well that autofocus is working in this newest iteration, and what the sensor's doing and what the image quality is, and where Canon's going. I think it's going to be a great camera, and my main advice to you guys is, if you're looking to upgrade this camera from the R6 Mark I to the Mark II, or coming from some other camera, is wait for it to come out. I know waiting is horrible, because, you know, in my last video on this one, I hate waiting on gear and stuff. I just want it now, I want it now. And we're all like that. Is go rent that camera instead of just going buying it flat out, and look at it. Compare it against your Mark I, if you have the R6 Mark I and Mark II. See if those features. You can only get so much from somebody like me or these reviewers that have hold of the camera to tell you about the camera. It's going to come down to your thoughts when you pick the camera up, how it feels to you, how it takes pictures, and see if those new features are really worth it from the 1 to the 2, or coming from some other camera into this R6 Mark II. Maybe come from the R7 to the Mark II. Rent it, see if those features really suit your needs. Because the biggest thing is, like, I've done a couple things, I've done that move, and I didn't test the camera out first. And when I got it, all these new neat features that I thought were really cool to use, I either didn't use them or I didn't like them. So go definitely test that camera out before you go buy it. That'd be my biggest advice to you guys. So anyway, those are my musings. That's my thoughts on this camera. If you want to go watch something next, go watch this video over here, and I'll see you on the next episode. You guys stay safe, go run that shutter. Take care.